Good morning, guys. I am going to follow up and do one addendum, some extra information for chapter 9. I'm going to specifically, because I didn't cover this in my previous lectures, I'm going to specifically cover muscle fiber types. Okay, so that's the heading in your textbook. Muscle fiber types, I'm going to call it my first whiteboard here. Let's get on with it. So in skeletal muscle, we're back to skeletal muscle. This is not smooth muscle. This refers to skeletal muscle. There are muscle fiber types. There's 3 types. I'm going to cut to the chase in the human body, 3 defined types. But how those types are categorized or characterized is based on 2 criteria. So the first thing I'm going to write is there are 2 characteristics that help us categorize muscle fiber types. Okay, so this is the criteria that we use to make the designation. Okay, so the first characteristic is by, so I'm just going to put a number 1. These are not, I'm not talking about, these are the actual muscle fiber types, but this is how we categorize them. And the first characteristic we look at is speed of contraction. How fast that muscle fiber contracts. So, and we just say that a muscle fiber is either slow or fast. What determines that? So I'm just going to put in parentheses, slow or fast. And how we determine a muscle fiber is either slow or fast is, so I'm going to say determined by how fast that particular fiber, the myosin enzymes, they're called ATPases, split that ATP molecule. So how fast, I'm just going to say enzymes, split that terminal phosphate off of ATP. And, sorry, I'm just having trouble writing on this glass surface, as I usually do when I'm up at the top of a whiteboard. So just be patient, please. And the activity of their motor neurons. And activity of, that's the nerve that's stimulating the fiber. So all we're saying is this: we designate a fiber either slow or fast based on how quickly that fiber can split that terminal phosphate off of ATP and how fast the motor neuron is stimulating it. So it's either slow or fast based on those 2 examinations or criteria. And secondly, we characterize muscle fiber types based on the pathway in which they form ATP. I'm just going to write pathways for forming ATP. What does that mean? Well, remember, we discussed different ways a muscle can form ATP, either by direct phosphorylation, glycolysis, which is anaerobic, or aerobic respiration. So the fibers that rely on oxygen or aerobic pathways for ATP formation are called oxidative fibers. So I'm just going to write oxidative fibers. We call fibers oxidative if they rely on oxygen for forming ATP. And then I'm going to put cellular respiration. So if they use cellular respiration and oxygen to form their ATP, we call them oxidative fibers. Fibers that rely on anaerobic pathways, the absence of oxygen to form ATP, are called glycolytic fibers. So glycolytic fibers if they do not rely on oxygen to form ATP. Remember, that process is called glycolysis. That's why they're called glycolytic. So there we go. So we're going to categorize muscle fiber types based on speed of contraction and the pathway for which they form ATP. And like I said at the beginning of this, I'm going to cut to the chase. There are 3 types of muscle fibers, of twitch muscle fibers in the human body. So I'm going to go through the 3 fiber types on the next page. So here they are. 3 skeletal muscle fiber types. Okay. Category number 1, these are called slow oxidative fibers. The name is going to tell us everything we need to know about them, and I'll help you interpret it. So without even going into explanation, these are slow. I'm going to go back to my previous board. That means that they're not really fast at splitting ATP on the myosin head, and their motor neurons are not super fast, okay? So slow, that's the slow part. Oxidative means they use oxygen to form ATP. So down here, they use oxidative fibers. They rely on oxygen to form ATP and cellular respiration. So when I go back to this designation, I know that they're slow at splitting ATP and their motor neurons are slow. And I know that they use oxygen, cellular respiration to form their ATP. Now I'm going to give you some physical descriptions of what these fibers look like, okay? These fibers tend to be small in diameter. So they're not super powerful either when they produce contractions. They're best suited for endurance exercises. Things like long swimming, long distance swimming, long distance running. They have many mitochondria in their cells. That makes sense to us because the mitochondria is an organelle in the cell that does what? It uses oxygen and an energy source to produce ATP. So there's a lot of those in there because they're oxidative. They have a high degree of vascularization. So I'm going to put an arrow up, increased. That means they have a rich, direct blood supply. And finally, they have a high content of myoglobin. Remember, myoglobin is the protein that binds and stores oxygen. So all these things make sense, these descriptive characteristics for a slow oxidative fiber. Next to myoglobin, I'm just going to put when oxygen binds myoglobin, it turns bright red, just like in the blood when it binds hemoglobin. So these fibers tend to be red in color. All right. The second type of fibers, skeletal muscle fibers in the human body, are the other extreme. We're going to call those fast glycolytic fibers. The name should tell us exactly what's going on. Fast, the word fast means that the myosin heads, actually the enzymes on the myosin heads split ATP, that terminal phosphate, very fast. Also, their neural activity, the neuron stimulating the muscle cell, is also can stimulate it very fast. So that's why it's given the fast designation. Glycolytic means it does not use oxygen for forming ATP. It uses glycolysis. All right. So now I'm going to describe what these fibers are like, and this will make sense. These fibers tend to be large in diameter, so they are powerful contractors. Okay. They have large glycogen stores. I'm going to put large. Glycogen is just a stored form of glucose. And then in parentheses, the reason they have large glycogen stores is for an anaerobic production of ATP. No oxygen, but they have to use glucose. So I'm just going to put for anaerobic production of ATP. These fibers are very powerful, but they fatigue quickly. They're powerful and they fatigue. So they're not well suited for endurance exercises. They're well suited for power weightlifting or doing something very fast. These tend to be, they don't have a rich blood supply. So I'm just going to put decreased vascularization. They also have a very low, very little myoglobin content. Why? Because they don't need to store oxygen, because they don't use oxygen to produce their ATP, and they have low myoglobin. So these tend to be white in color. These fibers tend to be white in color because they do not have a rich blood supply, nor do they have a lot of stored myoglobin that binds oxygen. All right. They also have very few mitochondria, very little mitochondria. Again, because they don't use oxygen. So we've got slow oxidative fibers that use oxygen. They're good for endurance exercise, yada, yada, yada. And we have fast glycolytic fibers on the opposite end of the spectrum that are large in diameter, don't use oxygen, very powerful, but they fatigue quickly. And then there's a third type that is sort of between these two. So we've got one extreme, the other extreme, and then there's a third type that's going to be sort of between these two, in between these two. And I'm going to go to my next whiteboard and write number 3. These are called fast oxidative fibers. So these tend to be fast in terms of splitting ATP, how fast their enzymes split that terminal phosphate, and how fast their neurons stimulate the muscle fiber cells. So they tend to be fast, but they also use oxygen. So they're a combination of numbers 1 and 2. So we call these, I'm going to put intermediate fibers. Okay, these, as the name suggests, are oxygen dependent. So they use cellular respiration in the mitochondria to produce their ATP. They're oxygen dependent. They do have a rich blood supply. By the way, that's what brings the oxygen to the cell. It's the bloodstream. But they do not have a whole lot of myoglobin. So I'm going to put rich blood supply, not much myoglobin. So they have a rich direct blood supply, but because they don't have a lot of myoglobin, they can't store a lot of oxygen. They just use it up. They contract fairly quickly, hence the name fast. but they're more resistant to fatigue. So I'm going to put contract quickly and more resistant to fatigue. That's due to their rich blood supply and oxygen coming in. Okay, now here's an asterisk worth noting. A muscle is typically made, any muscle in the human body is typically made up of all three fiber types. Right? Muscle is made up of all three fiber types. Whether or not that muscle is used mostly for a specific activity, like power weightlifting, weight resistance exercise, or endurance exercise, whatever, that depends on how many of those fibers happen to be in that muscle. So certain muscles have more of one fiber type than another, but most muscles have all three of some sort. So here's another asterisk worth mentioning. Fiber number 3, the fast oxidative fibers, those intermediate fibers above, can be recruited to become either number 1 or number 2 based on the activity of the human body. Can be recruited to become a number 1, which was a slow oxidative fiber, or number 2, which was a fast glycolytic fiber, based on the demands of body activity. All we're saying is this. Let's just say you want to become a marathon runner. And so you start training for that for months and months and months. As you are training, because of the demands you are putting on your body to become an endurance athlete, these number 3 fibers, fast oxidative fibers in your body, can slowly transition to become, in this case that I just described, a number 1 fiber, which would be a slow oxidative fiber, best suited for endurance. And you become a marathon runner, these number 3 fibers basically change into number 1 fibers because of your training to help your body accommodate the demands put on it. Now, let's say you change your mind and you want to quit being a marathon runner and you want to become a power weightlifter or a sprinter for that matter. So you start weight training, resistance training, doing power types of muscle building exercises. These fast oxidative fibers that were recruited originally to become marathon fibers, they revert back to, when you stop running long distances, they revert back to being number 3 intermediate fibers. And then you start your new training and they can become fast glycolytic fibers to help you become a power weightlifter. So it is possible to sort of change the makeup of your muscle fiber type based on the demands of the body activity. We all have all 3 types of muscle fibers in our muscles. But genetically, we're all born with a little bit different makeup of how many number 1s, how many number 2s, and how many number 3s we have in what sort of content we have in all of our muscles. So that concludes muscle fiber types, which I wanted to talk about first. The second thing I wanted to talk about before I leave you is graded muscle contractions. So I'm going to go pull up a new whiteboard. And I'm just going to write a new header, graded muscle response. What this topic is about in your book, I'll explain, is fibers. I'm going to write this first. Muscle fibers, we're talking about skeletal muscle fibers here, not smooth muscle fibers. I'll just verify that. Skeletal muscle fibers A nerve cell, a motor neuron cell that innervates a muscle fiber cell, it fires its electrical stimulus, releases that neurotransmitter. It fires either 100% or not at all. So it either fires completely or it doesn't fire at all. Likewise, a typical muscle fiber, when it receives that neural impulse, it also exhibits an action potential, an electrical stimulus on its sarcolemma, either all or not. So individual skeletal muscle fibers contract all or none. That means that when a skeletal muscle fiber is stimulated, it either contracts completely or it doesn't contract at all. That's fact. So then how do our muscles vary the power, the tension, the force at which they produce when they contract? Why then are our muscles, our entire muscles, why do they not perform complete contractions or nothing at all? Here's why. A muscle can perform a graded contraction response, that means varied, based on basically two things. So this means graded muscle response means a variable tension can be produced using two mechanisms. So a muscle can be graded in one of two ways. So the conundrum is, if a muscle fiber contracts completely or not at all, then how do our muscles know to use very light contract or light production of force when we pick up a piece of paper, as opposed to when we pick up a 30-pound weight? We need a lot more power to do that. How do our muscles do that? Here's how they do it, using two ways. The first one is called temporal summation. The word temporal means time. Summation means additive or adding. So this is when we change the stimulus frequency. That's what that word means. I'll explain. What this means is, if we increase the firing rate coming from the nerve cell, that motor neuron, then the second stimulus or third stimulus that's delivered by that neuron is additive. The tension produced is greater than the first. So I'm going to explain this to you in a picture format. If I draw a graph and I'm measuring the amount of tension that's produced, just think the amount of force of contraction over time. Let me give you an example. If I stimulate a muscle and it contracts and produces tension, and then I don't stimulate it, I let it rest, the tension produced goes back down, the muscle relaxes. If I stimulate it again, and then I wait, the muscle relaxes, the tension goes down. So if I stimulate a muscle, say once every 5 seconds, this is what happens to the tension that's produced, okay? Now I'm gonna increase the stimulus frequency. I'm gonna stimulate it with the nerve cell faster, more often. So let's just erase this. Now I'm gonna stimulate the nerve cell, and it does this, produces tension, and I'm not gonna give it a rest or as long of a rest. I give it a shorter rest, and I stimulate it again really quickly. Then the tension that's produced, the force that's produced by the contraction increases. And if I stimulate it faster, 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 the amount of tension or force increases. That eventually peaks. A muscle can only produce so much force. So if I stimulate this muscle cell, here's the nerve fiber. I stimulate this skeletal muscle cell once, and I wait. Once, and I wait. It doesn't produce a whole lot of contraction force, but if I stimulate it once, twice, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, if I increase the firing rate from the nerve cell, the tension that's produced in the contraction force increases. So one way we can increase or change the variable tension produced by a muscle contraction is by changing, I'm going to put increasing stimulus frequency, all right, from the nerve cell. The second way we can vary a muscle contraction force is by number 2. Number 2 is called multiple motor unit summation. And in this one, we're not talking about increasing the firing rate from the nerve cell. We're talking about how many fibers, muscle fibers in a particular muscle that we stimulate, okay? So this is, this controls the number of fibers stimulated in a muscle. So we use this method to change the response of the muscle contraction, the force of the muscle contraction, by stimulating small muscle fibers first, few of them, and then we increase the number of fibers that we stimulate if we need a stronger contraction. So I'm going to write this. First, I wrote it controls the number of fibers stimulated in a muscle. Then I'm going to highlight this fact that small, I'm going to put in parentheses, weaker fibers in a muscle are always stimulated first. Then larger, stronger fibers are typically stimulated. I'm going to say as needed, depending on how much force is necessary to move a load. Classic example. If you walk over to pick up a box off of the floor and you have no idea if it's empty or if it's full, and if it's full, how heavy the things are inside of it. It's an unmarked box. The nervous system works in conjunction with the muscular system. You bend over to pick up that box, and if you find it's completely empty, your nervous system only had to recruit or stimulate the small, weaker fibers in your skeletal muscles in order to lift that empty box. Now, let's say you different scenario, you bend over and you find out that box is filled with a bunch of lead weights. And so you start to lift it, and very quickly your nervous system, it stimulates the small, weaker fibers first, but then feedback to your nervous system tells you, I need to get more muscular contraction involved, and then it stimulates larger, stronger fibers in order to lift that heavier weight. So just to repeat, I'm going to go back to my previous board here. Sorry, this one. A graded muscle response just means a varied contraction. How do our muscles vary their contraction? If you want to pick up a piece of paper or you want to pick up a 40-pound bag of concrete, for example, there are 2 ways your muscles can do that. The first is by changing the firing rate. That's what temporal means. It means time. So we change the rate of neural stimulation. Faster we stimulate the muscle, the more tension it produces, because it's additive. That's the word summation. We can also vary a muscle contraction response through multiple motor unit summation, meaning we vary the number of fibers that are stimulated in a muscle based on what the demand is calling for. Finally, this is it. It's the last thing I'm going to say. So the force of a muscle, skeletal muscle contraction. Now we can make some statements based on those two varied ways for a graded muscle response, is affected by 4 factors. The force of a muscle contraction is really affected by, I'm just going to list these as 1, 2, 3, and 4. First, the number of fibers stimulated. Just talked about that right here. Also within that number of fibers, remember we said the small fibers, weaker fibers are stimulated first, larger, stronger ones are stimulated later if necessary. So I'm going to write size of fibers. Helps determine the force of muscle contraction. Number 3, the frequency of stimulation. That was back to just number 1, temporal summation, in which if we increase the firing rate, we're increasing the frequency of stimulation. And finally, I didn't talk about this one, is the degree. There's not a lot to say about it, so I will right now, but the degree of muscle stretch. So the length of the muscle prior to contraction does play a role in how much force it can produce during contraction. Just think of it this way. If a muscle is overstretched or stretched way out when it's stimulated to do its contracting, it's not able to produce its highest level of force through contraction. It can't contract ideally if it's really stretched out, nor, if I'm using 2 extremes here, if the muscle is already partly flexed, if it's already partially contracted before it starts a contraction, then it also does not produce its peak amount of force. So what I tell students is this: if you hold your arm out perfectly straight and at your elbow, it's perfectly straight, there's no flexion there at all, it's completely extended, your biceps muscle is extended to its maximum. It's difficult to get that contraction going from that position. Think about it. If you try to do pull-ups on a pull-up bar and your muscle and you're dangling and your arms are completely extended, it's hard to start generating that force. Likewise, if you're doing that pull-up and you're already 3/4 of the way pulling yourself up, meaning you have flexed your arms almost completely, that biceps muscle also doesn't produce a lot of force. So the ideal force comes from, if the muscle is too stretched out like this, can't contract to its full force. If it's already 3/4 contracted like this, it also can't produce ideal or the most amount of tension and force. If a muscle, there is an ideal degree of muscle stretch prior to contraction that also dictates a little bit the force that muscle can produce. All right, guys, we finished up completely. I've talked about everything in chapter 9, so you should be good to go. Watch this video as much as you'd like, ask me any questions, and enjoy the rest of your break. I will see you when I see you, okay?